Buenos dias, amigos. Okay, just doing a little bit something different right now. I got a new camera, one of these vlogging cameras that's supposed to be higher definition, has an external mic on the whole thing. So I'm kind of giving a test run for that. But I'm going to try to use the board here a little bit more too. Just a short little subset to follow up on the American Revolution component to it. So, and as far as the class is concerned, this is optional. I need to do one thing before I continue. So if you want to not pay attention or not listen to this, I get it, okay? Anyway, so just some questions I wanted to ask, in association with the American Revolution. And the first one is, how did the British lose this war? And if you think about it, it just doesn't make that much sense. Great Britain was this extraordinarily powerful country with this huge navy, huge merchant marine, powerful military apparatus, powerful army, and somehow they lose to these 13 upstart colonies. It really doesn't make that much sense whatsoever. So I want to just confront that particular issue. And I'm going to do that by presenting to you an analogy, which is from American history. An analogy is when you see something similar that happened at one time may help you to understand something that happened at another time. And we can sort of see that and when we're looking at why the British lost. So the analogy I'm going to turn to is what happened to the United States in Vietnam. Now, there is one that just doesn't seem like that's a no-brainer. I mean, how in the world could the most powerful country in the world, by far, massive economy, massive military apparatus, army, navy, air force, nuclear weapons, everything you would think to need to be absolutely victorious over this teeny tiny little postage stamp of a country. Now, LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, was extremely unkind when he called it a raggedy ass, fourth-rate country. I mean, it's so unkind, so racist, so condescending an attitude, but that's what he said, and that was sort of the American attitude for many, and that's kind of an indication of the problem. But how in the world could the United States of America lose a war to Vietnam? I mean, come on, how could something like that happen? So I'm going to tell you just a little bit about what happened in Vietnam, and I'm going to use each one of them kind of as a way of understanding what happened to the British in terms of the American Revolution. So one thing we look at why the Americans lost in Vietnam was an essential misunderstanding of the situation. For the United States, all they could kind of see was red. All they could see was the spread of communism, perceiving communism as led out of Moscow, perceiving every single communist entity as a puppet of Moscow, and we could just see that there was this kind of flow of communism, the domino effect kind of notion, and the Americans decided, of course, wherever it shows its ugly head, we need to rise up and stop that. The Americans positioned themselves as what some people call the guardian at the gates, to stop any kind of spread of communism. But what they missed was the internal dynamics of Vietnam. The essential thing that Vietnam wanted was simply to be an independent country. And they thought that the Americans would understand that. Vietnam for a very long time had been a colony of France. That's what the situation is leading up into World War II. And in the aftermath of that, Ho Chi Minh was absolutely communist. I'm not going to say that he wasn't, but I feel like he was primarily a nationalist. He wanted an independent Vietnam. And he actually wrote a series of letters to Harry Truman, President Truman, in the aftermath of World War II, in which he asked Truman to help Vietnam to become an independent country. And in the letters, it's just interesting. He evoked, it's a classic evocation. He evoked George Washington. He said, "I want to be the George Washington of my country. I want to lead Vietnam to independence." And so the primary issue for Vietnam was not the issue of communism. It was the issue of independence and self-determination. And the Americans just couldn't see that. I mean, we should have been able to see that. We should have known that if you've been a colony, if you've been oppressed by a foreign power, then you're going to want to overthrow that. And yet, and I've always wondered to myself, if back in that moment when the letters were being written to Truman, if Truman had simply said, "If you drop the commie crap, we'll help you," I got a feeling that Ho Chi Minh would have dropped the commie part, because all what he really wanted was an independent Vietnam. But the United States never really understood exactly what the Vietnamese were fighting for their nation, fighting for themselves, which gave them an extraordinary willingness to continue this very long and very difficult war. So, this basic understanding becomes an essential flaw in the American situation. Another thing that was really problematic about Vietnam was the irregular nature of warfare. So routinely, the United States was not fighting against a military, although there was the Army of North Vietnam, and they could do some serious stuff. Routinely, it was more against like the insurgencies of South Vietnam, the Viet Cong, and these were peasant soldiers, peasant warriors, who would one moment be a farmer, and one moment, of course, be a soldier who's fighting against the Americans, and putting booby traps out there and hiding in these tunnels all over the place and doing all those things that were so difficult. The United States could always pretty much take what it wanted to take. If it wanted to take a hill, it could take a hill. If it wanted to go here, it could go there. But the second they vacated that location, then the Viet Cong would come back and take it over. So it's like they would have had to control every square inch of Vietnam, and it just became a super impossible thing to do. So the irregular nature of warfare becomes ultimately, part of the downfall as far as the Americans of Vietnam are concerned. Another issue was foreign aid. That consistently throughout the entire period, the Vietnamese, North Vietnam, was being underwritten to some degree by Communist China and by the Soviet Union. So there was a constant flow of weapons and munitions, AK-47s and things that they would need to continue the fight, basically. And so the Americans, they didn't just have to overcome, of course, the ability of Vietnam, but also the fact that the Vietnamese are being supplied by external entities. And then a critical problem in Vietnam just became a huge issue was the ultimate demoralization of the American soldiers. The soldiers began to realize the problematic nature of this war. They're there fighting, but the objectives seemed problematic. They would take a hill and then they would move away from the hill, and the hill would be then they have to take the hill again. And increasingly, it just became a situation where the soldiers didn't feel like there was a meaning in what they were doing. And we see a tremendous amount of drug abuse among the veterans of Vietnam. We see desertion taking place among the veterans of the soldiers of Vietnam. I mean, there's a classic picture of Vietnam I always think of, where you got an American soldier with their flak jacket on and their helmet, but on that canvas covering over the helmet, the guy had drawn a peace symbol. And of course, you guys know that just is a wash. If you're a warrior, you got to go to war. And so a warrior who's banding about a peace symbol is obviously, there's a situation of relative confusion there. And, the tragedy for the Vietnam veterans, of course, they come home to a nation that doesn't treat them very well. It's divided in its own kind of way. So the demoralization of the American soldier in Vietnam became a critical part of the ultimate failure. Finally, there was the divided home front. It took a while for this to really happen, but by the time you get to even the mid-60s, Americans are extremely divided over the issue of the war in Vietnam. I was a child at that time, but I remember, at dinner tables, where if Vietnam would come up, it could just explode. I mean, there was those who supported, those kind of hard hat, conservative Americans, and those that didn't, the hippies, the youth, who really began to see this as a very problematic behavior. And those protests would hit the streets, and they were just all over the place. And you'd have, again, like the hard hat element, war, we've got to promote war, and we've got to promote the war, we've got to promote America first, love it or leave it. And then, those that were protesting the war, and they would clash sometimes in really physical and dynamic ways. America was grotesquely divided over this particular situation. And when finally in 1968, when there was the Tet Offensive, which kind of just showed that the Americans really weren't in control of the situation, it did begin to get to that situation of the government to vote to disengage, to begin a process, a long, very long process of disengagement, where we began to try to turn the war more over to the Vietnamese. It's called Demoralisation, but where we also continued massive bombing raids upon North Vietnam and into Laos and Cambodia, Ho Chi Minh Trail. More bombs were dropped on Vietnam than during the entire period of World War II. So, and of course, with no significant positive result. But anyway, all of these things put together, the fact that the Americans didn't really understand what the Vietnamese were all about. There was a recent, I can't think it was Ken Burns, but they did that documentary on Vietnam, just a really powerful, often causing you to cry sort of documentary. And you just see the fervor of the Vietnamese and their desire for their independence. That was the essence of the whole kind of the situation. The irregular nature of the warfare, the foreign aid, the demoralization of soldiers, the divided home front. These are all like a recipe for disaster. And in the end, of course, it didn't matter how powerful America was. Now they're going to lose this war in Vietnam. Well, in the situation for Great Britain, it's almost exactly the same, okay? They never really understood what the Americans are about. They would see the Americans as just spoiled brats who didn't want to pay taxes and didn't want to have this kind of interference, when the Americans were increasingly just dedicated to the cause of self-governance and representative government, and the British could never quite see that situation. Although in the American Revolution, the irregular nature of warfare wasn't exactly the same, the Americans did create a regular military, the Continental Army, and that became the major force for fighting. The Americans always had the irregular part going for them too, the militia. And the militia were just the men of America. And it was kind of like what happened in Vietnam. One day that guy would just be a farmer, you know, and the redcoats are walking by and he's just a farmer. And the next day he's got a musket and he's trying to kill these guys, you know. So you did have that kind of irregular dynamic that becomes part of the problem that the British would face. Not to mention the fact that there's the civil war between the loyalists and the patriots. It just causes all kinds of confusion and all kinds of chaos. There's also the issue of foreign aid. The French were, this is more important in the American Revolution than it was really. Yes, the Chinese and the Russians did aid the Vietnamese to some degree, but in no way as much as the French did for the Americans. Sending men, material, money, you know, all of it. You know, Marquis de Lafayette, all this stuff is coming over from France, the Navy. All of it is a huge boon to the Americans, giving them a huge advantage in many ways. So that became a powerful thing. I do want to emphasize the demoralization of the soldiers. I feel so sorry in many ways for the redcoats. You know, they're the villains of the story, at least as far as the Americans are concerned. But these soldiers come over. They were just the poor kind of underclass of Great Britain. They were thrown into an army that was ruthlessly unkind to them. And, you know, the officer class were aristocrats, the men were the commoners, and of course, and the class distinctions always manifest. And they were treated just awfully in many ways. And they were put into a place in a war where there was like no end at the end, no light at the end of the tunnel. It kept getting longer and longer, where there was no hope of them ever getting to get home or anything like that. I may have mentioned to you guys already that over 5,000 redcoats deserted during the American Revolution, going over to the American side. And it shows there's some serious problems there. And by the way, many of them, and you know, it was kind of problematic. They ran away from the British Army, and then of course the Americans were suspicious of them. But you know, one of the only places they found that they could kind of end up was in the Continental Army. So they start the war fighting for the British, and they would end the war upon occasion fighting for the Americans. And that's clearly a suggestion of a problem situation as far as the soldiers are concerned. And then finally, there was the divided home front. From the very beginning, the moment the Americans declared independence, there were voices in Great Britain that said, let them go. You know, it's not a problem. They'll still be our trading partners. It's, you know, why is it that we feel like we should cling to them? And as the war continued and continued to get worse, the voices in Great Britain became more strident. The